Hello, everyone. Uh, During the first day of the conference, we talked a lot about the policies that need to be in place or are in place to improve the biomass utilization for heating. And in the BioScreen project, we made this real life investigation of 4 communities of how they utilize biomass and what their alternatives are. Um, just to be on the safe side and to explain that these are basically practical implications, these are very concise calculations of how different scenarios for replacing the firewood with other alternatives. I need to tell you that when we're talking about the firewood phase out and our general disposition to believe that there needs to be a reduction in the firewood use, and in the best case scenario, we need to fully avoid the use of wet wood in our communities. This may not be the most realistic scenario in real life. When we're talking about energy transition, the spotlight should be on transition. Policies need time to take off. And when we're saying that tomorrow we don't need firewood anymore, it doesn't mean that we have to stop using it from tomorrow onwards. It means that we need to think about other alternatives. We need to think of them in perspective. We need to think about them in terms of how much time it will take for us to make a policy, alternative policy, take off and actually make a transition, not some revolution in using some other alternative. When we're talking about the firewood utilization in Central and Eastern Europe, we're talking about a history and a long tradition of this use. People are used to it. It is mostly used in small communities where there are basically no other alternatives like infrastructure for centralized heating. The supplies of other energy sources are limited and so on. People there usually consider that the firewood is the cheapest option, and their economic disposition suggests that they would go for the cheapest option, actually. There is a mindset that firewood is environmentally friendly, whereas later on, I will show you that probably it's not the best way of thinking. And there is definitely a lack of investment opportunities and potential for the firewood users to invest into alternatives. So when we're talking about the alternative scenarios to biomass or firewood use, let's be even more specific, we're talking about energy innovations for these communities that will cut through the tradition. And usually this is opposed by the communities because everything new is difficult to get familiar with and get used to it. So we're talking about a revolution in the local energy use. When we're talking about the alternatives and providing new energy sources on the local energy markets, we're talking about new partnerships, new business models, new market actors. And this is a very slow process that needs a lot of time for adjustment to find the right balance between the costs, the investments, and the benefits for the community. And last but not least, just changing the firewood use is not enough for the local communities to achieve high energy efficiency and energy independence. So looking at the different possibilities for shifting from firewood use to some alternatives, the best way of thinking, in my view, is to go to the closest alternative, and that's the alternative biomass, as we may call it. These are, again, biomass-based products that have added value on the market, like the pellets, the chips, the wood briquettes. All of them are again biomass, but they have better energy characteristics. Of course, the community heating plants are a great way to replace the old firewood use. We can do biogas plants that are locally based, close to local communities, utilizing local resources. We can do chips plants, again, biomass-based, but with extreme efficiency. We can do energy cooperatives like community RES installations and plants that can supply energy to the entire community and thus achieve a great impact. And last but not least, we can again do some decentralized renewable-based scenarios where each family gets a replacement of its old fire stove with some new PV installation or solar thermal or something else. So there are a few pathways that we can think of and that we can combine. In the project, we investigated 4 municipalities from Bulgaria, Romania, and Hungary. All of them surprisingly have similar features. So we collected data through local survey. In Romania, we did it through the forest administrations because the lack of data on local level is dramatic, so to say. We investigated the energy consumption because biomass and firewood use is just a small part of it. And we needed some bird's eye view on the energy consumption. So most of them used firewood, and usually they co-fired it with coal or some other materials, sometimes even illegal materials like paper, cloth, and such things. I know it's unthinkable, but yeah, this is a common practice with the energy poor households. We thought of what alternative energy options they could have. For example, other types of solid biomass and biomass-based products, replacement of their heating devices only on individual basis, or common community-based installations. We would say that the use of firewood in these 4 communities across the 3 countries is about 10-15 cubic meters. So we would accept that this is a realistic value for our region. And we came up with 4 or 5 alternative scenarios per pilot. We compared the wood that could be saved through improving an alternative scenario, the emissions that could be saved or avoided, and the financial savings and the investments needed. Because sometimes we need a multiple assessment of the benefits that a scenario would provide, and thus decide which way to go. Of course, a mix of different scenarios is the best way to go. Now, talking about the scenarios. So the first one is always the dry wood scenario. As I already explained, we are talking about the closest alternative. And the closest one is usually when they're using firewood, but with lower moisture content in it. This makes it more energy efficient, actually. This is, I'm going to future jump a bit and tell you that this scenario proves to be one of the best options, an immediate solution to a lot of problems. Then the second scenario we're talking about is the so-called pellet stove scenario. This is a general name for a scenario in which we're replacing the firewood with biomass-based products with added energy and market value, pellets, briquettes, and so on, chips sometimes. The third scenario that we investigated based on the survey is the alternative energy mix scenario. So in each of the surveys, we had a question asking people if you had the opportunity to switch to something else, to some other energy source, what it would be. For example, natural gas, electricity, PV, solar thermal, whatever. So this third scenario is about what people really want. Vox populi, vox dei. This scenario usually has an underlying condition that we also implemented dry wood policy. And the fourth scenario is about the community heating. In 2 of the pilots, we tried to come up with a solution for a community heating on biogas and on chips, and we tried to estimate the benefits if the entire community or more than 50% of the community would switch to the community-based heating. Now, going from scenario to scenario, the drywood scenario, as I told you, one of the best scenarios so far. This is about introducing a drywood policy. The firewood needs to stay at least 1 or 2 seasons to dry up and its moisture content to go below 30%. In these cases, we can have an immediate saving of 40% of the wood resources and 50% of the air pollution in the communities. As we talked yesterday, the unsustainable use of firewood has a rebound effect, and that's the extreme air pollution in the winter season. So talking about firewood use and how it impacts not only CO2 emissions, but also the air pollution, it means that if we stay with wood, we need to consider if not only the CO2 emissions are okay, but also the air pollution outside. And in the drywood scenario, the fact that the wood being dried for at least 1-2 seasons has better energy values, it means that it also has a better impact on the environment. Unfortunately, for this scenario, we need time. We need at least 1-2 seasons till this policy takes place. It is usually rejected by the retailers or the companies selling firewood because they don't want to slow down their businesses for 1 or 2 seasons. Also, the prices are changing and so on. So another option for the local communities is to go to the end users and try to introduce a burn right campaign in which they say, okay, slow down your consumption a bit, try to dry up the wood in the best way possible, and you're going to get more energy out of it. Usually we're talking about this scenario in combination with checks of the heating installations. This is a lack in East Central and Eastern Europe that we're usually not talking about. And there are policies in the Western European countries for the winter check, the checks of the heating installations before winter. This gives the local authorities the knowledge of what the status of the heating in the community is. Now, going to the second scenario, the pellet stove scenario, in which the entire community shifts to biomass-based products with improved quality of the biomass and improved heating devices, because pellets, chips, briquettes, for example, they need to be burned in highly efficient stoves. So here we also have individual replacement of devices. This requires investment on behalf of the households and the users. This scenario demands investments and financial schemes to support the people to change. From the surveys we conducted, we see that people are bit more happy to shift to a biomass-based product that is different from firewood, but still is being burned like firewood, and it feels like firewood, but actually it's not. So this scenario has great potential in terms of the behavioral change and how it is going to fit into the energy behavior of people. Again, because we're talking about wood and biomass, this scenario can be implemented with burn right campaigns and checks of the heating systems. One of probably the immediate concerns about this scenario is the market makeover that it requires. So as I explained already, sellers of firewood, retailers, they don't really want to change their businesses. But in order for them to fit into this scenario, they will have to readjust their market performance from just simple primitive firewood to advanced biomass products. The scenario achieves about 30% wood savings actually across different countries and 80 to 90% savings in the emissions. So it has better environmental impacts than the drywood scenario, but it will definitely take more time to implement because it requires some market makeover. The third scenario, it's about the other energy sources different from biomass. I'm just putting a note here that if we're going to allow households to switch to something else in biomass, we need to ensure that the households that are still using biomass are using good products. So this scenario needs to go in combination with either dry wood policy or incentives for biomass-based products with added energy value. So it needs to go with the previous scenarios. When we're diversifying the local energy mix, we can go to different options that are not biomass-based and that have different other implications on the environmental effects. In the investigation that is pretty specific for these countries, we could see that 70% of the wood could be saved because some households just stop using wood. That's why the effect is twice as high as the previous ones. But we have sometimes very low savings when it comes to the CO2 emissions and the PM reduction, because other energy sources tend to have higher emission values for CO2 than wood. And in this scenario, so to say, we need to consider the benefits vs the costs of introducing an energy source that may save wood but bring more emissions into the energy mix. And the final one, the community heating scenario, it's pretty specific for our project. It achieved about 20 to 70% wood savings, but under the condition that more than 50% of the population uses it. So this scenario is highly dependent on the number of people who would like to join a community plant, for example. It requires enormous investments to set up the plant, to set up all the pipe network, the infrastructure, to change the devices. It is a considerable investment for the local authorities, and usually it would go with a business model with an external company or an investor that is willing to take the risk. Usually the small communities we're talking about and we're investigating in our project wouldn't have the financial capacity to implement such a scenario themselves. They would need external investment. In the case of community heating, we have pretty good emission savings. We could achieve about 50% reduction of the CO2 emissions and 70 to 80% reduction in the air quality pollutants. So we would definitely go for such a scenario under the condition that people would like to join, that the investment is there, and the local authorities are willing to incentivize the households to shift to it. In all other cases, this scenario is highly unrealistic and may slow down the whole transition process. So as a very short conclusion from all the scenarios, there needs to be comprehensive and integrated energy planning. In our investigation, we are talking only about firewood use, but there are other energy sources in these communities as well, and we need to very well synchronize the energy planning of a firewood use and its phase out with other sustainable options. There is a need for complete energy renovation of these communities because from the surveys we saw that the households using firewood are close to energy poverty. They're extremely vulnerable. They don't have good insulation. They don't have good windows. They use poor quality fuel in poor quality stoves. All of these conditions pile up together, and if we only change one stove and we don't change the windows, we don't put insulation, we don't change the energy habits of people, the impact will be tiny and even insignificant. But if we go for a complete makeover of the energy efficiency of a building and the residential sector in these communities, then we can achieve amazing savings with just a small effort. Going from scenario to scenario, yet again, to summarize the findings, dry wood policy is the ideal transition policy. It may give the local communities a chance to speed up on different alternatives, to implement them. It will give them time to establish new business models, to find investments, to prepare the community for a change. And it will and this dry wood policy will achieve a very quick positive impact on the environment in terms of wood saving and emissions. Then when we are talking about the alternative biomass, we know that the approach needs to promote a new biomass market in the local communities. So this one is a good opportunity for communities that are highly dependent on wood, that do not really want to quit wood, to change their market so that they can embed the wood and the biomass use into their energy mix in a sustainable way. Talking about the alternative energy sources different from biomass, already explained, there will be always a fraction of the community that doesn't really want to quit biomass, and there will be always a fraction that will reject biomass and say, okay, I want, for example, to use electricity, heat pumps. I would like to have geothermal installations and so on. Here, the tricky part is to see if introducing new alternative energy sources into the energy mix won't bring us to increased emissions. And finally, the collective heating, it has high potential to reduce the biomass dependency. But it requires a lot of financial efforts, and it is highly dependent on the number of people who would like to join. So when we're talking the human factor in energy transition, things get really difficult to predict. So that's it from our investigation with pretty specific numbers. I hope that we managed to bring forward a trend in these scenarios. And yet again, we've discussed specific scenarios, and we haven't really combined them. But in truth and in practice, the best way for energy transition is really to combine different policies and to give ourselves time to see which policy will take off easily among the population, and it will be adopted without significant objection from the citizens.
Thank you very much.